It's been a while since I've done one of these paintings, but here we are, and this time with 3 different movie scenes. All of them with a completely unique set of challenges, but also with a slightly different approach and focus. There are dozens of different materials, there are compositional challenges, but also just a very different feel and vibe to them. All of them are painted with one single color palette though, except for one extra color, but we'll talk about that once we get there. It's actually quite interesting. All 3 of these paintings will be available on my website by the time you're watching this video. So if you want to have one of them, you might have to be quick, head over to my website and grab it while you can. And with that, let's talk about one of my absolute favorite things to do when I have a bit more time on my hands, which is walking in the footsteps of the great illustrators of our time and painting for the fun of it, like the masters of illustration. For all 3 paintings I'm using the exact same color palette, so the colors from my modern portrait painter set. If you don't have it yet, head over to my website, grab one while you still can, it's limited edition. And I'm also using the exact same painting surface. Primed, super crazy heavy watercolor paper. One of my absolute favorite things to paint on. If I could do it at a giant size, I would use that material because it's just so good and versatile. But usually it's limited to smaller paintings, mainly because of the size, but also because when it's bigger you run into framing issues, all kinds of other issues, all of that kind of stuff. It's not super popular or well known, even though some of the greatest illustrators of our time essentially painted on exactly this type of painting surface, illustration board or something that's very similar to this. But to me, it's genuinely one of the things that's most fun to paint on. So all of the scenes have the exact same painting surface, although a slightly different approach. This one, for example, I started with an acrylic wash. You've seen me start paintings on a white painting surface, on a colored painting surface, with acrylic paint, oil paint, without a drawing, with a drawing. But this one in particular, after transferring my outlines, I wanted to start with a colored painting surface rather than a white painting surface, because if you use it smartly, colored painting surface that is, you can actually cut the time it takes you to create the painting in half. This only works if you're smart about it though. You can't just put down any color and expect it to have the exact same effect. No, you have to analyze what you are painting, and then you have to find the one color or the one tone that permeates the entire painting. In this scene from 300 here, of course you have the red capes and a lot of skin and flesh and muscles, but if you had to kind of pick one color, the scene is mostly this bronze, golden, ochreish, yellowish tone. And if I'm able to recreate that and get as close to it as possible in my underpainting layer or in my color layer, what I'm essentially doing is I'm painting without painting anything. This is sort of setting up something in the future where I don't even need to paint things because the color is already there and I can just leave it in places. And this is what eventually allows me to just skip painting some parts of the painting, and this significantly reduces the time it takes me to create an image like this. You gotta think about it though. It's not this automatic thing that you can just apply, so one color fixes all of your problems. No. I see so many young and aspiring artists just tone their canvases in this reddish, brown, umber or whatever color just because they've seen other artists do it, they've seen the old masters do it, but nobody really thinks about why they're doing it. So there is no real questioning, why am I doing this to begin with? And most of the time it doesn't even work with the modern color palettes that we're using or the modern color compositions that our paintings have. So each painting is different. This one here, as you can see, has a completely different color or base color to it. If I used yellowish or brownish or reddish color as my base, it would completely go against everything, every color in the image. There is nothing like that in the scene that I'm painting here. And because of that, I decided to go with something that's much more neutral, something that will allow me to go in every direction, make the image a bit warmer, cooler, but something that also allows me to tie the different elements together without creating unnecessary contrast, unnecessary color, unnecessary bits and pieces of color popping up here and there. Even if I left the color shine through, it would look very natural and it would integrate into the image rather than stand out. Of course, this doesn't mean that you can't achieve something similar with a different colored surface or a white canvas, but why wouldn't you make life easier for yourself whenever you can? I mean, these scenes that I've chosen are not the easiest to begin with. I mean, actually quite challenging. This one here for very different reasons than the 300 one, while that one is all kinds of different materials. You got like fabric, you have skin, you have metal, you have atmospheric perspective, so you have an atmosphere there, you can see into the distance, but then you also have the illusion of hundreds of people. It's not very easy to paint. This one here, also not very easy to paint, but for a very different reason. It's kind of hard to tell at the moment, but this is more like a night scene, so you have like this cool moonlight, but then you also have like another light source in the back somewhere creating this bluish rim light. And having a lighting situation like that is actually not super easy to paint. I mean, if you ever looked at, I don't know, an apple or a banana at night, I can guarantee you it's not yellow. It doesn't look yellow, it looks yellow to our eyes, but the color itself is not really yellow that we're seeing. It's affected by the surrounding light, the lack of light, the color, temperature of the light, all of that stuff. And it's very similar here with the color of the turtles. It's mostly gray and kind of cool brownish green, and they actually have a completely different shade of green originally, but I have to paint it slightly different to make it look that exact shade of green in the end when all the colors come together. I know it's kind of hard to imagine and follow, but you'll see how it comes together in the end. I'm just now realizing that even though I haven't planned for it, in a way I made a video about forgotten movies. I mean, there was a 300 one. I barely hear anybody talk about that movie these days. I mean, it's also, I don't know, like probably 15, 20 years old now, but genuinely a spectacular, impressive movie. The cinematography, everything about that movie is just lightning in a bottle and way ahead of its time, I feel like. And Zack Snyder, by the way, gets a pass for forever for making that movie. I don't care about any of the other movies he made. Then there's also the Turtles movie here, and I don't know if anybody remembers that. This one's gotta be like 30 plus years old, I guess, from the 90s. Or is it 80s? Late 80s, early 90s, something like that. A wild movie, by the way, if you've never seen it. I guess it was supposed to be a kids movie, but that is anything but a kids movie. Nobody would make something like that these days, unfortunately. Not only the themes and morals and contents of the movie, if nothing else, this Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie is a masterpiece in costume making and puppetry. If you didn't know, here's a fun fact. The same guy that made the Muppets,
Hello, little people.
the Muppets that we know and the Muppet costumes, also made the costumes for the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie. Jim Henson. And he, in fact, is or was so good and so far ahead of his time that if you go back and look at some of the costumes and puppetry that he created, it is almost unimaginable that someone was able to do something like this 30 plus years ago. It's genuinely mind-blowing. And I feel like even today, people are struggling to create something that comes even close to what he was able to create. And then we're moving even further back in time with this movie scene here from the movie Aliens. as you all hopefully know, which is by far the hardest of all three paintings. This one, in fact, is the only one that's actually even giving me trouble painting it, for a couple of reasons actually. If you look at the scene, it's basically just blue and orange. No real skin tones or color. It's just blue environment and also this artificial blue lighting. And then also her skin tones, which are mostly yellow, red and orange because she's lit by fire or something in the scene. And all the colors super intense, by the way, which is why I chose to go with a white painting surface rather than a toned down or colored one. And painting something so intense is actually not that easy and not as straightforward as it may seem. You have to manipulate the colors and manipulate the way you paint, and you apply the paint to create like maximum luminosity. For this painting, this meant using a lot of transparent colors wherever possible and little to no white paint at all to create like maximum intensity. But doing that, on top of all the other challenges, which is a super small scale, in fact so small that it's almost impossible to paint like the tiny facial features. I know it doesn't look that bad at the moment, but this is only because of the lens that I'm using for the camera that's recording. In reality, if you are painting, if you're in front of it, it's at least 20 to 30% smaller than what you're seeing here. And painting at this scale is already kind of hard, but painting someone that we are familiar with and creating likeness, especially with someone as particular looking as Sigourney Weaver and Ellen Ripley, is, it can be, let's put it this way, very, very annoying. Much more annoying than painting a large group of people. Getting back to the 300 painting here and Leonidas and the Spartans. It's also kind of challenging and tricky, but still manageable. I mean, the main thing here is to find the balance between what to actually paint and what to suggest. Not getting lost in all the details and in every tiny element, but rather painting something without painting it, creating the illusion of detail. The more you can notice that it's starting to turn into just little blobs of paint and brushstrokes. And this is the part where I'm not actually painting anything really, but rather I'm just putting little bits and pieces of color next to each other without judging or questioning or doing anything, because in the end it will all come together to create the illusion. Now, in the moment where you're painting, it doesn't look like anything. But the thing is, everything has to be seen in context. So here, for example, you can already see that, oh, okay, there is a lot of stuff going on there in the background. But I haven't painted anything. I have not painted a helmet really in the background. There are no muscles or shields or anything. It's just the illusion. And speaking of shields or the armor, you can see that in many places I haven't painted anything at all, which goes back to what I was saying about creating the illusion and setting yourself up to paint something without painting it. This is in and of itself not particularly hard to do. The hard thing is to make the right decisions, to know when to do what. When do I focus on the details? When do I completely disregard individual elements, details? When do I simplify? Where do I put the focus? It's a lot like a movie director, I can't stress this enough, that has to orchestrate the viewing experience by pushing the background further back or blurring areas out or moving the camera in a certain way. And what I am doing here, what we are doing whenever we create a painting, is pretty much exactly the same thing. Of course, the main focus here is Leonidas in the foreground with a super intense stare, ready to go into battle amidst this like chaos around him. And because of that, I'm putting most of my energy into him and also adding most details of the image into the foreground and him. And I'm doing that all kinds of different ways, using small brushes, but also using a razor blade to really get very, very small details. And all of these details combined with the contrast and how detailed and realistic it is, creates like an area of focus, which is exactly what I want. With the turtles, one of the big challenges is the lighting situation. So nighttime scene, moonlight, all of that stuff. But then there's also the fact that there is just 4 of them, which is 4 times as much work. Yeah, in a way, 4 times as hard to paint. The other thing is that for this scene in particular, I had to use 1 more color. Here's the thing. There are sometimes colors that you just cannot get any other way than just using a different pigment. And you probably wouldn't guess which color it is. If you look at the image here, you can already see it. If you guessed, you would probably guess the wrong one, is my suspicion, because it's not the orange, it's also not the red. It's actually Leonardo's blue bandana. Yeah, it doesn't look like much, and you might be wondering, what's the deal with this bandana? Well, the thing is, my paint set has ultramarine blue, which is great and very intense when you use it transparently. But whenever you mix it with white or any other color, you lose a lot of intensity. Now, most of the time, this is not an issue. You rarely come across something that's very intensely blue, actually in real life, ever. So for most, 90%, 95% of cases, using ultramarine blue is perfectly fine and more than enough. But sometimes you have these very intense blue colors, and in those cases, you just have to go with a different pigment. Something that is still very intense when mixed with white, or much brighter to begin with, or much darker to begin with, depending on what you need. Or a bit less green or a bit less purple, depending on which kind of blue you are actually painting. So for this one, I needed to substitute my ultramarine blue only for the bandana, and I used cobalt blue. Very intense, also very beautiful blue actually, but that one is much more opaque, it's not transparent, and while good for this kind of stuff, I wouldn't use it for when I'm painting faces or just pretty much anything really, most of the time. But after figuring all of those things out, it was actually just a matter of finishing it off. Going over all 4 turtles a second time, unfortunately, making adjustments here and there, refining areas, and of course adding the background. For the aliens painting though, for the background in particular, I switched back to ultramarine blue. Because even though cobalt blue is great and intense, when used transparently, ultramarine blue just hits different. It's so not only intense, but also luminous and beautiful in a way. It's kind of hard to describe. So this here again is 100% ultramarine blue, and as long as you don't add any white or too much other colors to it, it's just absolutely intense, beautiful, and vibrant. So for the background, like 90%, that's what I used. And on a side note, I guess I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Ellen Ripley is probably one of the coolest, most badass female fictional characters ever. Am I wrong? I mean, don't get me wrong, the Alien movies are all absolutely fantastic, and obviously like the art direction, production design with like H.R. Giger's world that he created, essentially, it's absolutely mind-blowing. But the character of Ellen Ripley and how she looks with her jumper suit, I think it's called. I don't know, there is something about this character that just stands out to me. Which is partly the reason why it was super important to me to capture the likeness here for this one. Which I kinda managed to pull off, not as much as I would love to maybe, but again, You gotta be realistic. At this small scale, there is only so much you can do. But it's always kind of like this. You know, whenever you start a new project or painting, you gotta make a decision. Like, what's most important to me? If I wanted to prioritize likeness, for example, I would have chosen a completely different medium. Maybe colored pencil, or maybe just a drawing, or maybe even gouache or something like that, which allows you to be much more detailed and much more controlled. But there's always a trade-off. You know, I could have never created something with this much depth of field and this intensity. And you always gotta ask yourself, what's most important to me? And for me, likeness is always important when I paint something like this, but at the same time, I always want to create an image that feels kind of alive and vibrant and organic, for lack of a better word. And I feel like in the end, I sort of managed to strike a balance between all of those things. Whenever I make these types of videos, I always wonder in the end if anybody is really gonna care about anything here. Like, do people still remember these movies? I wouldn't be surprised if 50% of the people watching this video have never seen the original TMNT movie, which I feel like is a shame. Makes me feel old, but I also kind of feel bad for you, so lose-lose situation, I guess. But they're genuinely great movies, I guarantee you, much better than what you can see on the streaming platforms these days. I have seen Arcane. I'm not impressed. Not at all. Maybe one of the most overrated shows I've ever seen. So yeah, I would argue you are much better off watching one of these than that. Let me know if you want to see a video about that, maybe the art style of Arcane and why it's actually not really impressive. And what else you would like to see me paint in the future, movie scenes or else. And if you want to grab one of the paintings, as I said, they're on my website by the time you're seeing this video. Grab them while you can. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video.